Smoke drifted across the fields where villages once stood. Charred beams jutted like broken ribs from the earth, and the air reeked of soot and hunger. Peasants with hollow eyes wandered among the ruins, clutching what little remained. A pot, a half-burned loaf, a child too weak to cry. On the horizon horsemen lingered, their armor dark with grime, their banners tattered by wind. This was not a raid, not a passing disaster. This was life in France during a war that would outlast generations. The 100 Years' War did not begin as a century of blood. It began with a simple question: who should sit on the throne of France? In 1328, King Charles IV of France died without a male heir. His crown, once secure upon the heads of Cape Town kings for centuries, suddenly stood empty. The choice of successor would not only decide who ruled France but would reshape Europe itself. The English King Edward III believed the crown should be his. Through his mother, Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, he claimed the right to inherit. He was young, ambitious, and eager to prove his power. But the French lords rejected him. They turned instead to Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king, invoking an ancient tradition known as the Salic Law, which barred inheritance through the female line. What should have been a legal debate became a spark thrown into dry wood. Edward saw insult and betrayal. France saw defiance and invasion. From the moment Edward claimed not only the throne of England but also the crown of France, the conflict could no longer be contained. As armies gathered and fleets prepared, neither kingdom realized what they were unleashing. This was not to be a war of months or even years. It would stretch across reigns, outlive kings, and consume peasants, nobles, priests, and children alike. For the people who tilled the soil and prayed for peace, the 100 Years' War was not a struggle of dynasties but a storm that would batter their lives without end. And so the bells that once tolled for a coronation now tolled for war, ringing across France and England alike. A dispute over a crown had become the opening act of one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in European history. The dispute over the French throne quickly became more than parchment and seals. Edward III of England, proud and ambitious, could not accept being denied what he saw as his rightful inheritance. Through his mother, Isabella of France, he traced his blood directly back to Philip IV, a king of France. To Edward, the line was clear. The crown of France belonged to him. But the French lords would not permit an Englishman to sit upon their throne. In the Great Assembly at Vincennes, they invoked the Salic Law, a centuries-old custom that barred succession through the female line. By this rule, Edward's claim, though legitimate in blood, was declared invalid. Instead, they placed the crown on the head of Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI of France. It was a practical choice for the French nobility. They feared that allowing Edward to inherit would make France a dependency of England. Yet to Edward it was not reason but robbery. He had been insulted, his lineage denied, his honor trampled. What began as a question of law became a matter of pride and ambition. First, Edward bided his time. He did homage to Philip for his French territories, Aquitaine among them, but resentment simmered beneath the gesture. Tensions mounted as disputes over land, trade, and loyalty multiplied. France sought to expand control over the wealthy Flemish towns. England sought allies among them, for Flemish merchants depended on English wool. Economic rivalry sharpened dynastic rivalry, until both crowns bristled with grievance. By 1337, the fragile peace snapped. Edward formally renounced his homage to Philip VI and boldly declared himself King of France. He ordered the lilies of France to be quartered with the lions of England on his coat of arms. It was more than symbolism. It was open defiance, a direct challenge to Philip's legitimacy. Both realms prepared for war. In France, banners were raised, and knights pledged service to their Valois king. In England, Edward rallied his nobles with the promise of glory and the lure of French lands. What began as a dynastic quarrel now marched toward the battlefield, carrying with it the fate of kingdoms. Few could foresee how long the struggle would last. What seemed like a contest between two men would stretch into a conflict of nations, spilling over into every corner of Europe. The rival crowns had been claimed, and with them the destiny of 100 years of war. When the war began, most of Europe assumed France would crush England swiftly. France was larger, richer, and its knights had long been the pride of Christendom. England was smaller, its resources thinner, and Edward's claim seemed more like bold theater than real threat. Yet, as the first campaigns unfolded, it was France, not England, that would taste humiliation. In 1337, Philip VI confiscated Aquitaine, striking at Edward's power on the continent. Edward answered with raids across northern France and alliances with Flanders, whose wealthy towns depended on English wool. For the first time, England wove economic power into its war effort, turning merchants into allies and trade into a weapon. Then came the seas. In 1340, the Battle of Sluis shocked Europe. Edward's fleet of merchant ships, hastily armed, clashed with the proud French navy. By day's end, French ships lay wrecked and burning, their sailors drowning in the Channel. The victory gave England mastery of the seas and ensured that its armies could land on French soil again and again. But the true test came on land. In 1346, Edward invaded Normandy with a disciplined army that relied not on heavy cavalry but on something humbler, the longbow. At the Battle of Crécy, French chivalry thundered forward in wave after wave of mounted charges. Each time they were met by a storm of arrows loosed by English archers. Horses fell screaming, knights collapsed in the mud, banners toppled. The flower of French nobility lay broken, undone not by equal knights but by common bowmen. 10 years later, the disaster repeated itself at Poitiers. This time it was King John II of France himself who rode into battle. Once again the longbows sang, and once again French pride drowned in blood and mud. John was captured, a king taken prisoner by another king. The ransom demanded was colossal, and the shame deeper still. The early campaigns of the 100 Years' War shattered illusions. France, thought invincible, bled under the blows of an island kingdom. England, underestimated, showed that discipline, trade, and new tactics could humble even the proudest throne. What had begun as a dynastic quarrel was becoming a revolution in the art of war. Just as the war gathered momentum, a far darker enemy swept across Europe. In 1347, a ship docked in Messina, Sicily, carrying rats and fleas infected with a new terror. Within months, the Black Death rolled like thunder through towns and villages, striking down peasants, priests, merchants, and kings alike. By 1348, it reached both England and France, turning battlefields into graveyards and palaces into tombs. The war did not stop entirely, but it slowed, warped by the devastation. Armies could not march when half their soldiers were dead or dying. Sieges collapsed when plague crept into camps. Men feared not the enemy's sword but the invisible breath of disease. Chroniclers describe cities where carts piled with corpses rattled through empty streets, where fields lay untilled, and where prayers rose louder than war drums. For France, already reeling from defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, the plague was ruin upon ruin. Noble families lost heirs overnight, villages vanished, and rebellion simmered as peasants demanded relief from endless suffering. For England, though buoyed by military victories, the plague struck with equal fury. Entire villages disappeared from the maps. Fields were abandoned, and laborers became scarce, forcing wages upward and shaking the social order. In both kingdoms, the Black Death became a silent participant in the 100 Years' War. Battles paused, truces were signed, not out of mercy but necessity. Neither crown could claim triumph over the other when the plague claimed victory over both. Even Edward III, triumphant conqueror of France, lost his beloved daughter Joan to the disease. For him, the war for a throne suddenly seemed smaller beside the grave of a child. And yet, the plague's devastation did not bring lasting peace. Instead, it hardened the resolve of rulers desperate to assert control over crumbling societies. For the survivors, war remained the familiar rhythm of life, even as death hovered in every breath of air. When the Black Death finally receded, the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Populations were cut in half, economies transformed, faith shaken to its core. Into this shattered landscape the 100 Years' War returned, fiercer than before, as though kings had learned nothing from the silent plague that had humbled them both. When the Black Death loosened its grip, both France and England tried to return to war. But the plague had changed everything. Whole villages had vanished, harvests were left to rot, and the survivors demanded wages for their labor that no lord wanted to pay. War taxes rose higher, while armies trampled fields and stole food from the very peasants who kept the kingdoms alive. Desperation boiled into rage. In France, that rage exploded in 1358 in what became known as the Jacquerie. Peasants, weary of knights who claimed to defend them yet left their homes to be pillaged, took up scythes, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. They stormed castles, killed nobles, and set fire to manor houses. Chroniclers described the fury of men who had endured too much hunger and humiliation. For a moment it seemed the natural order of medieval society had been turned upside down. Peasants lording over knights, masters fleeing from servants. The rebellion was crushed swiftly and brutally. Noble armies slaughtered thousands, punishing villages that had dared to rise. Yet the fear lingered in the hearts of the aristocracy. They had seen what happened when the burden became too heavy, and they knew it could happen again. England would face its own reckoning 2 decades later. In 1381, the peasants' revolt shook the realm. Angry over poll taxes imposed to fund the war in France, peasants marched on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler and a radical priest named John Ball. Their message was simple but terrifying to the ruling class. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The revolt demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and justice for the common man. For days London burned. Royal officials were executed by mobs, and the teenage King Richard II was forced to face the rebels in person. He promised reforms to calm the storm, only to break his word once the rebellion dispersed. Leaders were executed, order restored, but the seed of resistance had been planted. The Jacquerie in France and the peasants' revolt in England revealed the deeper truth of the 100 Years' War. It was not only kings and knights who suffered. Ordinary people bore the heaviest weight, and sometimes they rose to throw it off. Though their uprisings were crushed, they exposed cracks in the feudal order that war and plague had already begun to break. When the 100 Years' War began, most believed battles would be decided by armored knights charging across the field. For centuries chivalry had ruled warfare, noble against noble, horse against horse. But the conflict between England and France shattered that illusion. New weapons, new tactics, and new kinds of soldiers emerged, changing the very nature of medieval war. The symbol of this transformation was the English longbow. At Crécy, at Poitiers, and later at Agincourt, it was not knights but common archers who brought kingdoms to their knees. 6-foot bows, drawn by men hardened from childhood, loosed arrows with terrifying speed. Horses fell in heaps, knights were pinned to the ground, and the proud cavalry of France collapsed in chaos. Nobility learned that their titles offered no shield against a storm of arrows. Mercenaries, too, reshaped the battlefield. Companies of professional soldiers sold their swords to the highest bidder, sometimes changing sides when coin ran out. In France, these free companies became both weapon and plague, raiding villages during truces, living off the land like bandits. For peasants, it made little difference whether the rider in their field wore the fleur-de-lis or the cross of St. George. Both came to take. Both left ashes behind. And then there was gunpowder. At first it appeared in crude bombards, more dangerous to those who fired them than to their enemies. But over the decades cannons grew stronger. By the end of the war they smashed through castle walls once thought unbreakable. The age of stone fortresses and nightly sieges was ending. A new, brutal era of artillery had begun. These innovations eroded the old code of chivalry. Battles were no longer tournaments of honor. They were contests of discipline, technology, and ruthlessness. Kings needed not only knights but archers, gunners, and engineers. War was no longer the privilege of the few, it was the burden of entire nations. The 100 Years' War thus became a crucible in which medieval warfare melted and something new was forged. The knight in shining armor remained a symbol, but on the battlefield his time was passing. The longbow, the mercenary, and the cannon now ruled, and with them came a harsher, more modern vision of war. If England was France's external enemy, Burgundy often proved the enemy within. The duchy, wealthy and ambitious, stood at the crossroads of France, the Low Countries, and the Holy Roman Empire. Its dukes controlled cities like Dijon and had influence over the great trading towns of Flanders. In wealth and power, Burgundy rivaled kingdoms. And during the 100 Years' War, its loyalties shifted like the wind. At first Burgundy stood with the Valois kings, supplying troops and resources. But rivalries inside France soon turned deadly. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407, ordered by Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy, ignited a civil war within France itself. The kingdom split into two factions: the Armagnacs, loyal to the crown, and the Burgundians, loyal to John. What had begun as a quarrel over succession to the French throne now spiraled into fratricide. England seized its chance. While French nobles slaughtered each other, Henry V of England launched his invasion. In 1415 he crushed the French at Agincourt, a battle where thousands of knights lay dead in the mud, undone once again by English longbows. France's nobility, divided and weakened, could do little to resist. Burgundy's role was decisive. After John the Fearless was himself murdered in 1419, his son Philip the Good allied with England. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles, the rightful Valois heir. France was now carved in two, the north under English and Burgundian control, the south clinging desperately to the Dauphin. For the common people, Burgundy's shifting loyalties were a curse. Towns changed hands overnight, allegiances switched with the signature of a duke, and peasants were left to pay taxes to whichever side held the nearest castle. The French crown, weakened by betrayal within, seemed ready to collapse. And yet, out of this chaos, new voices would rise. The Dauphin, weak and disheartened, would find an unlikely champion in a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voice of God. Her name was Joan of Arc, and her arrival would alter the fate of both France and Burgundy. France seemed broken beyond repair. English banners flew over Paris, Burgundy had betrayed the Valois, and the Dauphin Charles hid in the shadows, mocked as a king without a crown. Villages lay in ruins, towns changed hands with every treaty, and the people of France prayed not for victory but simply for survival. It was then, from the least likely place, that hope appeared. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy arrived at the Dauphin's court. Her name was Joan, the daughter of farmers, untrained in arms, unknown to nobility. She claimed to hear voices saints who commanded her to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned king in Reims. At first the court laughed. A girl in peasant dress could not decide the fate of kingdoms. But desperation makes strange allies. Charles gave her armor, a banner, and a small force. What followed stunned Europe. At the siege of Orleans, Joan rode at the front, her white banner aloft. She was no commander in strategy, but her presence electrified the soldiers. Where men had despaired, she inspired. The French stormed the English fortifications, and for the first time in decades, victory was theirs. Orleans was saved, and the legend of the Maid was born. Her victories continued. She pressed Charles to claim his crown, and with her at his side, he marched through hostile territory to Reims. In July 1429, the cathedral bells rang as Charles VII was anointed King of France. The act was more than ceremony, it restored legitimacy to a throne nearly lost. And it was Joan who had made it possible. But glory bred suspicion. Burgundians captured her in 1430 and sold her to the English. Put on trial in Rouen, she was condemned not for war but for her visions, her defiance, her very existence as a woman in armor. In May 1431 she was burned at the stake, her banner torn to ash beside her. Witnesses said she cried the name of Jesus as the flames consumed her. Her death was meant to break France, yet it did the opposite. Joan's martyrdom inflamed the will of her people. She became more powerful in death than she had been in life, a symbol of divine favor and national unity. The tide of the war had turned, and the English would never again dominate France as they once had. The execution of Joan of Arc in 1431 was meant to destroy hope, yet it became the spark of renewal. Far from crushing France, her death left a wound that burned into determination. The Dauphin, now crowned Charles VII, could no longer hide in indecision. France demanded a king who acted, and Joan's sacrifice had shamed him into becoming one. Charles set about rebuilding not only his army but the very structure of his kingdom. France had been bled dry by decades of war, plague, and betrayal. Its nobility was fractured, its treasury nearly empty, its people weary of endless suffering. But Charles proved more capable than many expected. Slowly, methodically, he reformed his armies, introduced professional companies, and reduced reliance on mercenaries whose loyalty wavered with coin. The Burgundian alliance with England, once the nail in France's coffin, began to crack. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, saw that English fortunes were fading. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras reconciled Burgundy with the French crown, leaving England isolated. What had once been a triangle of power became a duel once more, and now the advantage shifted toward France. French armies, no longer scattered and undisciplined, pushed back. Town by town, fortress by fortress, they reclaimed their land. Normandy, once a proud jewel in England's continental holdings, fell back into French hands. The countryside, scarred by raids and scorched earth, slowly began to breathe again. The people felt the change. No longer did they see their king as a weak shadow. They saw in him the restoration of order, the promise that France could endure. Chroniclers wrote of Charles as cautious but steady, a ruler who preferred patience to rash charges. He lacked the glory of Joan's miracles, but he brought something more lasting: stability. By the mid-15th century, the English crown held only a fraction of what it once claimed. Calais remained their foothold, but the dream of ruling France had begun to crumble. The long night of humiliation was ending, and dawn was rising for the Valois dynasty. By the middle of the 15th century, England's grip on France had weakened to a handful of strongholds. What had begun as a confident claim to the French crown was now reduced to desperate defense. Normandy was lost, Burgundy had reconciled with Charles VII, and only pockets of English power remained. Yet even cornered, England fought on. In 1450, French forces shattered the English at Formigny, driving them from Normandy. 3 years later, attention turned to Gascony, the last jewel of English possessions. For generations it had been England's lifeline on the continent, rich in vineyards and trade. To lose it would mean the end of the dream of an Anglo-French empire. In July 1453, the armies met near the town of Castillon. The English, led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, marched with the confidence of old victories. Talbot was a veteran of Agincourt, a commander whose name struck fear into enemies. But the battlefield had changed since his youth. The French were now armed not only with knights and bowmen but with artillery rows of cannons entrenched behind defenses. When the English charged, expecting to scatter their foes as they had at Crécy and Poitiers, they found themselves torn apart by cannon fire. The thunder of gunpowder echoed through the valley as men and horses fell in heaps. Talbot himself was struck down, and with him the last hope of English resurgence. By day's end, the French had secured a decisive victory. Gascony fell, and with it, England's century-long claim to France crumbled. The Battle of Castillon is often remembered as the true end of the 100 Years' War. It was not a knightly duel of banners and honor, but a grim demonstration of artillery and discipline. The age of chivalry had been buried in mud and smoke, replaced by the roar of gunpowder. For England, the loss was devastating. A century of ambition ended in defeat, leaving only Calais as a fragile foothold on the continent. For France, the war's end marked rebirth. A fractured realm, once mocked as weak and divided, had emerged united under the Valois crown. The last clash had closed the book on a conflict that had scarred generations. Yet its echoes would not fade quickly, for the war had reshaped kingdoms, armies, and the very nature of power in Europe. When the smoke cleared after Castillon in 1453, the 100 Years' War finally ended. Yet peace did not mean relief. The war had scarred both kingdoms so deeply that their futures would never be the same. For France, victory came at a terrible cost. Towns and villages had been burned again and again, fields abandoned, harvests lost. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but war. And yet, from this devastation emerged something new, a stronger French monarchy. Charles VII had learned to build a professional army, no longer relying solely on feudal levies or mercenaries. Taxes became permanent, the crown's authority more centralized. Out of fire and ruin, modern France was being born. England, meanwhile, faced humiliation. The dream of ruling France had vanished, replaced with bitterness and financial strain. Veterans returned to find a kingdom in debt and a nobility restless from long campaigns. Within 2 years, civil war erupted, the Wars of the Roses, as rival houses tore England apart. What France had gained in unity, England lost in division. The war also transformed warfare itself. The age of the armored knight had passed. Longbows and cannons had proved stronger than chivalry. Castles that once seemed impregnable now fell to artillery. Warfare became less about noble honor and more about professional soldiers and new technology. The Middle Ages were ending, and something harsher, more modern, was taking shape. For ordinary people, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. Serfdom began to weaken as labor shortages gave peasants more bargaining power. In both kingdoms, commoners realized they were no longer powerless pawns. Their taxes had paid for the war, their fields had fed armies, their blood had been spilled, and they would demand more in return. The 100 Years' War was not a single story of victory or defeat. It was the crucible in which nations were forged, feudalism cracked, and the medieval world transformed. Its legacy stretched far beyond 1453, shaping the destiny of Europe for centuries to come. Even after the last arrows were loosed and the final cannon fell silent, the 100 Years' War lived on in memory. Chroniclers, poets, and storytellers carried its tales across Europe. To some it was a saga of kings and crowns, to others a long nightmare of fire and famine. Each generation reshaped the war in its own image, turning defeats into lessons and victories into legends. In France, the war became a story of rebirth. Chroniclers celebrated Charles VII as the king who restored the realm, but above all, they remembered Joan of Arc. Though condemned as a heretic by English judges, she was later honored as a saintly savior, the peasant girl who had lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned a king. Her martyrdom turned her into a national symbol, proof that God had not abandoned France. Songs and plays told her story, ensuring she lived in memory far longer than many kings. In England, the war was recalled with a different tone. The early triumphs at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were sung as proof of English valor. Chroniclers praised the longbowmen, the common soldiers who humbled France's nobility. Yet these glories carried a shadow. The ultimate defeat, the loss of nearly all French lands, weighed heavily on the English mind. Some called it betrayal, others destiny. But none could ignore the bitterness of ambition turned to ashes. For ordinary people, the memories were less heroic. They spoke of burned villages, vanished harvests, and the cruelty of mercenaries who plundered both friend and foe. In folk songs and tales, the war was not about crowns but about survival, hunger, and loss. These stories were quieter, but they endured, reminding future generations of the true cost of dynastic quarrels. The 100 Years' War became part of Europe's cultural fabric. It shaped national identities. France as a unified kingdom reborn from ashes, England as an island nation forced to turn inward and redefine itself. Memory turned suffering into narrative, chaos into history. And though the soldiers who had fought it were long gone, their stories lingered, echoing in chronicles, in ballads, in the hearts of nations still learning what it meant to be a people rather than just subjects of a king. The 100 Years' War did more than decide crowns. It reshaped the very idea of what it meant to belong to a kingdom. Before the war, most people in Europe thought of themselves as subjects of a lord, a vassal, or a town. Loyalty was personal, tied to feudal bonds. By the time the war ended in 1453, those bonds had begun to crack, replaced by something new, the sense of being French or English. In France, victory over England forged a national identity stronger than any before. Out of chaos and devastation, people began to see themselves not just as Burgundians, Normans, or Gascons, but as French. Joan of Arc became the symbol of that identity, a peasant girl who united nobles and commoners under the banner of France. The monarchy itself grew stronger, no longer dependent on feudal levies but on a standing army funded by permanent taxes. France had suffered deeply, but it emerged more centralized, more unified, and more powerful. England faced the opposite. Defeat forced the kingdom to look inward. With French lands lost, the dream of an Anglo-French empire died. Instead, England turned toward its own island identity. The memory of victories like Agincourt remained powerful, feeding a sense of pride in English arms, but the sting of failure shifted attention homeward. Within a few years, civil war erupted in the Wars of the Roses, tearing the nobility apart and laying the foundations for the strong Tudor monarchy to come. The war also accelerated the end of feudalism. Kings no longer relied entirely on knights bound by oath. They built professional armies, hired mercenaries, and used gunpowder artillery. Commoners who had fought with longbows and pikes became vital to victory. The voices of peasants, once silenced, began to matter in new ways, especially when rulers demanded taxes to pay for endless wars. Thus, from a century of ruin, two nations emerged. France, unified and reborn, ready to dominate continental politics. England, chastened but consolidated, on the path toward its own future as a naval power. The 100 Years' War had begun as a dynastic quarrel but ended as the crucible that forged nations. When the 100 Years' War finally closed with the fall of Gascony and the victory at Castillon, it left behind more than ruins and graves. It left a transformed Europe. What had begun in 1337 as a quarrel over succession ended in 1453 as a crucible that reshaped kingship, society, and the very map of nations. Its lessons were written in blood. Armored knights, once the pride of Europe, proved powerless before volleys of longbowmen and the thunder of cannons. Castles that had stood for centuries crumbled in days. Chivalry became a memory, replaced by professional armies and the rise of gunpowder. War was no longer a game of nobles. It was the business of nations. For France, the war delivered unity at an unbearable cost. Entire regions were scarred, villages erased, but the monarchy emerged stronger and more centralized. The Valois kings could now claim not only crowns but the loyalty of a people who thought of themselves as French. Joan of Arc's sacrifice became a foundation stone of national identity, proof that France belonged not to nobles alone but to the people who bled for it. For England, the war's end was a humiliation that forced transformation. Stripped of its continental possessions, England turned inward. Within 2 years it collapsed into the Wars of the Roses, yet from that chaos rose the Tudor dynasty and eventually a new kind of kingdom, one that would look across the seas rather than across the Channel. The war also reshaped ordinary lives. Peasants discovered their value when labor shortages after the plague raised wages. Taxation gave them a bitter awareness of their role in sustaining the crown. Their revolts may have been crushed, but the feudal order would never fully recover. Historians remember the 100 Years' War as both tragedy and beginning. It was tragedy for the millions who perished, for the burned villages and shattered families. But it was also the beginning of modern Europe. Centralized states, standing armies, and the rise of national consciousness. Even now, the echoes remain. The war reminds us how pride and ambition can unleash centuries of suffering, but also how resilience can forge nations from chaos. The bells that once tolled for coronations and campaigns still seem to ring in history's memory, calling us to remember that crowns may pass, but the cost of power is always paid by the people.